The world moves quickly, doesn't it? We rush from one task to the next, often without taking a moment to reflect on the lives happening around us. Our days are filled with deadlines, appointments, and responsibilities, all of which shape the rhythm of our lives. But if we take just a moment to stop, breathe, and look around, we may notice something that changes everything, a story of love, sacrifice, and hope that goes unnoticed in the hustle and bustle of life. This is the story of one such moment. Imagine this: you're walking past the hospital late at night. The long glass windows reflect the pale glow of the streetlights, and inside you can hear the soft hum of medical equipment and the rush of nurses and doctors going about their duties, trying to save lives. It's a busy, impersonal place, one where countless stories of struggle, survival, and loss unfold daily. Yet, outside the building, there's a scene that doesn't quite fit. Their small puppy, curled on cold concrete, its tiny body barely visible against the dark backdrop of the hospital doors. At first glance, it might seem like just another stray, another animal seeking shelter from the chilly night air. But as you stand there, something about this little puppy catches your attention. The sight of this tiny creature lying there quietly and patiently evokes a sense of deep curiosity. What could bring this puppy here, night after night, to sleep just outside a place filled with medical professionals and patients in need of care? At first, the hospital staff thought nothing of it. It wasn't an unusual sight. Stray animals wandering the streets often seek refuge near buildings, looking for warmth, food, or simply a place to rest. But as the days passed, something about this puppy's actions stood out to them. Unlike the other strays that came and went, this puppy didn't leave. It stayed night after night in the exact same spot near the hospital entrance. And it wasn't just the puppy's consistent presence that made it remarkable. It was the way it behaved. While other stray animals would dart away at the sound of footsteps or the hum of approaching cars, this puppy stayed put. It didn't show fear or hesitation. Instead, it sat there with its eyes fixed on the entrance, its tail occasionally wagging as though it was waiting for something or someone. Soon, the hospital staff began to notice the pattern. Every evening, without fail, as the night shift began, the puppy would appear, calmly taking its place outside the hospital. It didn't run or bark. It simply waited. The nurses, doctors, and patients would walk past it, some pausing to offer a kind word, others too absorbed in their work to give it a second thought. But there was something undeniably poignant about the puppy's nightly vigil. Dr. Michael Jacobs, a surgeon who worked long hours at the hospital, was one of the first to take notice. He had always been a man of logic, driven by facts, numbers, and scientific reasoning. And medicine was his world, and every day he worked tirelessly to save lives, using his skills and knowledge to bring healing where it was needed. But Dr. Jacobs, like many in the medical field, had seen his fair share of heartache. He had witnessed both the triumph of life and the sorrow of loss, each experience leaving its mark on him. On his late-night rounds, as he passed the hospital entrance, Dr. Jacobs would occasionally glance down at the puppy. At first, it seemed like just another stray, nothing more than a small, vulnerable animal seeking warmth and shelter. But as the days went by, Dr. Jacobs found himself increasingly drawn to the puppy. There was something about its presence, something that tugged at his heart, something that made him wonder why it was always there, never moving, always waiting. One night, after a particularly grueling surgery, Dr. Jacobs decided to stop and see what this little creature was all about. He crouched down near the puppy, who looked up at him with eyes that seemed filled with a quiet intensity. The puppy didn't bark or wag its tail aggressively. Instead, it simply looked at Dr. Jacobs, its gaze unwavering, as if it was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. He was intrigued. As Dr. Jacobs sat next to the puppy, a nurse approached him, her voice soft and uncertain. "Dr. Jacobs," she said, "I'm sure you've noticed your puppy outside. There's something strange about it." She hesitated for a moment, as though unsure how to continue. "What do you mean?" Dr. Jacobs asked, still kneeling beside the puppy. The little dog had settled into a more comfortable position now, still watching the hospital doors, its body relaxed but its eyes fixed intently on the building. The nurse continued, "The thing is, this puppy's been here every night for weeks. And it's not just a stray looking for food. There's something different about it. It waits for someone." Dr. Jacobs' eyes and eyebrow intrigued but skeptical. "Who could it be waiting for?" "It's just a dog, right?" The nurse nodded, but there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "Well, that's what we thought at first, too. But it's been waiting for the same person, one of our surgeons, Dr. Allen. He's the one who took the dog, and when it was first found, Dr. Jacobs felt a pang of surprise. He had heard of Dr. Allen, a kind and compassionate surgeon who had a reputation for going above and beyond for his patients. But the idea of him taking in a stray puppy was unexpected. "So this dog belongs to Dr. Allen?" Dr. Jacobs asked. The nurse shook her head. "No, not exactly. The thing is, the dog wasn't found by Dr. Allen on his own. It was actually found by him after hours. The dog had been abandoned, left on the street to fend for itself. Dr. Allen was on his way home from a long day, and when he saw the dog, he couldn't just leave it there. He brought it back to the hospital, gave it food and water, and even let it sleep in the staff room for a while." Dr. Jacobs blinked, a little taken aback by the nurse's story. That's kind of him. But why would the puppy wait outside every night? Why not just go home with him? The nurse sighed, Her voice tinged with a note of sadness. I think the puppy has formed a bond with him, a bond that goes beyond the usual human-animal relationship. Dr. Allen was the first person who showed the dog any kindness, and now it waits for him every night. It knows that Dr. Allen works late, so the puppy stays out here hoping to see him before he leaves. Dr. Jacobs felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known the power of human kindness, but this small animal's devotion was something different. This puppy had formed a bond with someone who had given it nothing more than food, shelter, and care, and yet this bond was so strong that the dog had made the hospital its home, waiting for the one person who had shown it compassion. It was a simple, pure form of loyalty, one that many humans could learn from. As Dr. Jacobs stood up and turned to leave, he glanced back at the puppy one last time. It was still there, as it always was, waiting with a patience that seemed almost otherworldly. He couldn't help but feel that there was more to this story, something deeper that he wasn't yet seeing. There was a mystery here, an unspoken connection between the puppy and Dr. Allen, something that had brought the two together in a way that defied logic. The next night, after finishing his rounds, Dr. Jacobs found himself walking to the hospital entrance again. The puppy was still there exactly as it had been before, but this time Dr. Jacobs didn't simply observe from a distance. He approached the puppy, crouching down beside it, and for the first time, he truly looked into the animal's eyes. What he saw there was not just the calm gaze of a pet. It was the look of an animal who had endured hardship, who had been abandoned, and who had found comfort in the presence of someone who cared. The bond between Dr. Allen and the puppy was undeniable. And in that moment, Dr. Jacobs realized something profound. Love doesn't always come in the form of grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from a simple act of kindness, feeding a stray dog, offering it shelter, and giving it the love it had been denied. The puppy had found its way to the hospital, but it had also found its way into the hearts of the people around it. And soon, the story of the puppy's nightly vigil would spread beyond the walls of the hospital, touching the lives of everyone who heard it. But what was the real reason behind the puppy's vigil? What was it waiting for? And what would happen when Dr. Jacobs finally discovered the truth? Dr. Michael Jacobs had always been a man of science. His world revolved around the precision of medicine, the calculated risks of surgery, and the often sterile environment of a hospital. Yet, over the years, he had learned to appreciate something more elusive: human emotion, the quiet yet powerful force that can shape the course of life in unexpected ways. He had seen that force manifest in countless patients, each facing the challenges of illness and injury, each responding in their own way to the trials life threw at them. But it wasn't until he encountered the puppy that he truly began to understand the depth of that connection. Every evening as the hospital's night shift began, Dr. Jacobs would pass the entrance where the puppy waited. It was a small thing, a scrappy little dog with a patchy coat and big, soulful eyes that seemed to follow his every movement. At first, Dr. Jacobs thought little of it. Strays were common around the hospital, often wandering in search of food, shelter, or simply warmth from the cold. Yet there was something about this dog that intrigued him, something different about the way it behaved. It wasn't like the other dogs that appeared and disappeared. This puppy was there every single night. It sat patiently on the sidewalk, gazing at the hospital entrance with an unwavering focus, as though it were waiting for something or someone in particular. The hospital staff had taken notice of the puppy as well, but it wasn't until Dr. Jacobs spent more time observing it that he began to see the deeper story unfolding before him. One evening, after a particularly taxing surgery, Dr. Jacobs walked out of the hospital to clear his mind. He had been working long hours as usual, and the sight of the puppy caught his attention once more. This time, instead of simply walking past, he stopped. He crouched down next to the little dog, who looked up at him with wide, expectant eyes. The puppy didn't bark or wag its tail in excitement as most dogs would do. Instead, it simply stared at him with a quiet intensity. It was as though the dog knew exactly who he was, something that puzzled Dr. Jacobs. He had never had any personal interaction with this puppy, yet it seemed to recognize him. "Hey there, little one," Dr. Jacobs said softly, more out of habit than anything else. He wasn't sure what compelled him to speak to the dog, but in that moment it felt right. The puppy responded by leaning its head slightly to the side, as though listening carefully to his voice. Dr. Jacobs reached out and gently stroked its head, feeling the softness of its fur under his fingers. The dog didn't pull away, didn't flinch or seem afraid. Instead, it leaned into his touch, its eyes still locked on him. As he continued to pet the puppy, a nurse who had been walking by stopped and approached him. "Dr. Jacobs," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and something else he couldn't quite place. "I see you're getting to know the puppy. There's something you should know about him." Dr. Jacobs turned to the nurse, intrigued. "What do you mean? What's the story with this little one?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the puppy with a look of sadness. "It's not just any dog, Dr. Jacobs. This puppy has been here every night for weeks waiting for someone." Dr. Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "Waiting for someone who?" The nurse nodded, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. "It's been waiting for Dr. Allen." Dr. Jacobs is taken aback. "Dr. Allen," he repeated, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "The surgeon." "Yes," the nurse said softly. "Dr. Allen is the one who took this puppy in when it was found abandoned on the street." Dr. Jacob stood up, his mind racing as he processed this new information. So it belongs to Dr. Allen? The nurse shook her head. Not exactly. Dr. Allen found the puppy, yes, but it wasn't his decision to keep it. The truth is, the puppy had already formed a bond with someone else, a patient here at the hospital. Dr. Jacobs was even more confused now. A patient. The nurse nodded solemnly. Yes, there was a woman who used to visit the hospital frequently. She was a patient, though not one who was here for treatment, at least not regularly. She came to the hospital for routine checkups and to see family members who were being treated. During one of her visits, she found the puppy abandoned in a back alley, weak and malnourished. She brought the dog to Dr. Allen, and that's how it all started. Dr. Jacobs listened intently, but the story was starting to take an unexpected turn. So this woman, she took care of the dog. Yes, the nurse continued. She nursed it back to health, gave it food, water, and a place to stay. Over time, she and the puppy formed a bond. She would bring it to the hospital with her whenever she came for her appointments, and it became a regular sight in the waiting rooms. The puppy became a comfort to her, a companion during the lonely hours she spent at the hospital. Dr. Jacobs nodded slowly. It was starting to make sense now. The woman had shown the puppy kindness when no one else had. In return, the dog had come to rely on her, finding solace in her presence. And Dr. Allen, being the compassionate man that he was, had helped care for the puppy, ensuring it was healthy and safe. But then the story took a darker turn. The nurse continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. The woman who took in the puppy passed away a few months ago. Dr. Jacobs was stunned. She passed away? But how? The nurse's face tightened with sadness. She had been fighting a long-term illness. It was something that had plagued her for years, but she never let it define her. She kept coming to the hospital smiling, bringing the puppy with her, even as she became weaker. But eventually her condition took a turn for the worse, and despite all efforts, she passed away. She never had the chance to say goodbye to the puppy. Dr. Jacobs felt a pang in his chest, the weight of the nurse's words settling heavy on him. He glanced down at the puppy, who was still sitting there quietly, waiting. The dog didn't seem to understand what had happened to its owner, nor did it seem to realize that the person it had grown so attached to would never return. The nurse sighed deeply. The puppy's been waiting ever since. It waits for Dr. Allen because it doesn't understand that the woman it loved is gone. It doesn't know that she's never coming back. All it knows is that Dr. Allen was the one who cared for it, who helped it when it was weak and afraid. So, it waits for him. The realization hit Dr. Jacobs with full force. The puppy wasn't just sitting there aimlessly, it was grieving, mourning the loss of the one person who had shown it love and care. It had been abandoned once, and now it was facing the heartbreaking reality that the one connection it had made in the world had been severed. In that moment, Dr. Jacobs understood something profound. The puppy's loyalty wasn't just to Dr. Allen, it was a bond forged in love and kindness and in the pain of loss. The puppy's wait was a symbol of its search for comfort, for a piece of its past that it could never reclaim. He watched the puppy for a moment longer, a deep sadness settling over him. He had seen countless patients come and go, many of them dealing with their own struggles and losses. But this little dog's devotion, its pure, unrelenting hope struck him in a way that nothing else ever had. You know, Dr. Jacobs said softly, more to himself than to the nurse, sometimes the smallest creatures teach us the biggest lessons. The nurse nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. It's true, Dr. Jacobs. It's a reminder that love and loyalty don't always follow the path we expect. They can come from the most unexpected places, from the most unlikely creatures. This puppy, it may never understand what happened, but it will continue to wait, as it always has. Dr. Jacobs stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of the puppy's sorrow. He looked down at the dog, whose eyes were still fixed on the hospital doors, unwavering in its vigil. I'll make sure Dr. Allen knows, he said quietly. He deserves to know what this little one has been through. The nurse smiled softly. Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. I know it will mean a lot to him. As Dr. Jacobs turned to walk back into the hospital, he couldn't help but think about the puppy's story, about the way love and loss could shape even the smallest of lives. In a world filled with noise and chaos, the puppy's devotion was a quiet reminder of the power of connection, of the deep bond that can exist between creatures, human or otherwise. And in that moment, Dr. Jacobs made a promise to himself he would never forget this little dog whose heart was as big as the world itself. The truth about the puppy's presence outside the hospital hit Dr. Jacobs harder than he expected. It wasn't just a story of a stray dog waiting for the person who had saved it. It was a story of loss, of grief, and of the quiet but powerful force that connects all living beings, regardless of their form or size. In the days that followed his conversation with the nurse, Dr. Jacobs couldn't shake the image of the puppy waiting every night, looking at the hospital's entrance with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. He found himself returning to the hospital entrance again and again, sitting beside the puppy, watching it wait for Dr. Allen. But with each passing night, it became increasingly clear that the puppy wasn't just waiting, it was mourning. Its eyes, once hopeful, had grown dull, as though it were struggling to comprehend the absence of the woman it had loved. The vigil was no longer just an act of patience, it was a symbol of heartbreak, a silent cry for the person who had given it life and hope. Dr. Jacobs couldn't help but reflect on his own life. He had spent so much time focused on his work, on saving others, that he had never truly understood the depth of connection that could exist between two living beings. He had always thought of love as something human beings shared, something that could be felt and expressed through words and actions. But now, as he sat with the puppy, he realized that love wasn't confined to humans. It extended to all creatures, even those who couldn't speak, couldn't explain their feelings. The puppy had loved its owner deeply, and now it was grieving her loss in the only way it knew how: by waiting. As the days passed, Dr. Jacobs began to see the puppy in a new light. It was no longer just a stray dog wandering the streets. It was a symbol of loyalty, of love that transcended death. It was a reminder that the connections we form in life are not easily broken, no matter how much time or distance separates us. He shared his thoughts with Dr. Allen one evening after the surgeon had finished his rounds. Dr. Allen had been unaware of the puppy's vigil, having been focused on his patients and his own grief. When Dr. Jacobs told him the story, Dr. Allen was visibly moved. "I had no idea," Dr. Allen said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought the puppy was just some stray that wandered in here, but now I see it was waiting for me. It's been waiting for me all this time." Dr. Jacobs nodded, his heart heavy with empathy. "It's not just waiting for you, Dr. Allen. It's waiting for the woman who cared for it. It's waiting because it doesn't understand that she's gone. It doesn't know how to move on. All it knows is that it's lost the one person who truly loved it." Dr. Allen's eyes grew distant, and for a moment, Dr. Jacobs saw the surgeon as more than just a man of medicine. He saw someone who had been touched by the same forces that had shaped the puppy's life: grief, love, and the overwhelming desire to make sense of the losses we experience. "I had no idea how much this little dog meant to her," Dr. Allen murmured. "I knew she loved it, of course, but I didn't know it was this deep." Dr. Jacobs could see the guilt in Dr. Allen's eyes. "You couldn't have known," he said quietly. "But now that you do, maybe you can help this little one heal just like you've helped so many others." Dr. Allen took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He looked over at the puppy, who was still sitting near the hospital entrance, its gaze fixed unwaveringly on the doors. It was as though it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Dr. Allen to see it, to understand its pain, and to offer it the comfort it so desperately needed. "I'll do whatever I can," Dr. Allen said, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. "But I need to make this right. I need to help this dog find peace." With that, the two doctors came up with a plan to help the puppy. Dr. Jacobs suggested that they try to recreate the sense of security and comfort the puppy had once felt with its original owner. They decided to spend time with the dog, showing it that it wasn't alone, that it had people who cared about it, who would offer it the love and care it needed. But they knew that it wouldn't be easy. The puppy's grief was deep, and its bond with the woman it had loved was unshakable. It wasn't a matter of simply feeding it or giving it shelter. They needed to offer it something more: a sense of emotional connection, of trust, and of hope for the future. The first step in their plan was to start spending more time with the puppy. Dr. Allen began to visit it each evening, sitting next to it and talking to it softly. He would gently pet the dog, trying to reassure it, hoping that his presence would bring it some comfort. At first, the puppy seemed hesitant. It would look at Dr. Allen with cautious eyes, unsure whether it could trust him fully. But as the days passed, the puppy began to relax. It would nuzzle closer to him, its tail wagging tentatively, as though it were beginning to understand that it wasn't alone anymore. Dr. Jacobs also spent time with the puppy, offering it food and treats and speaking to it in soothing tones. It wasn't long before the puppy began to warm to him as well. But even with these small signs of progress, Dr. Jacobs could sense that the puppy's grief was far from over. The dog still spent its nights sitting at the entrance, looking out for the woman it had lost, waiting for her to return. One evening, as Dr. Jacobs was sitting with the puppy, a patient who had been staying at the hospital for several months came by. The woman had been undergoing treatment for a chronic illness, and she had seen the puppy many times before. She had always been fond of the little dog, and she had often spoken to it in passing, offering it a kind word or two when she saw it in the hallways. When the woman saw the puppy sitting beside Dr. Jacobs, Jay paused and walked over to him. "Is this the same dog that's been hanging around here for weeks?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Yes," Dr. Jacobs replied. "This is the puppy that's been waiting outside every night." The woman knelt down beside the puppy and gently stroked its head. "I've seen it here so many times, sitting out in the cold. I've always wondered who it was waiting for." Dr. Jacobs nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "It's been waiting for the woman who cared for it. She passed away a few months ago." The woman's face softened with empathy. "That's so sad. Poor thing. It's been so loyal, so patient, but it doesn't understand that she's gone." Dr. Jacobs sighed deeply. "No, it doesn't. And it's been holding on to the memory of her, waiting for her to come back." The woman smiled gently at the puppy. "I don't know how much I can do to help, but I'll try. Maybe if I spend a little more time with it, it will feel less alone." The puppy looked up at her, its big brown eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. But as the woman continued to pet it, something seemed to shift. The puppy leaned into her touch, its tail wagging slowly, as though it was beginning to accept her presence. It was a small, tentative step, but it was progress. Over the next few days, the woman visited the puppy regularly, spending time with it and offering it comfort. Gradually, the puppy began to open up more. It would follow her as she walked down the hallway, its steps light and playful. It would sit beside her, its head resting on her lap as she gently stroked its fur. Slowly but surely, the puppy was starting to heal. The grief that had held it captive for so long was beginning to loosen its grip, and it was learning to trust again. Dr. Jacobs continued to observe the puppy's transformation, and with each passing day, he could see the change. The puppy was no longer waiting for its lost owner. It was learning to move forward, to accept the love and care of those around it. It wasn't an easy process and it wasn't immediate, but it was a process that gave the puppy hope that there was still love to be found, even in the wake of loss. By the end of the month, the puppy had found its place within the hospital. It was no longer the stray that had wandered in from the streets. It had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the power of love and loyalty. The hospital staff embraced it, offering it food, shelter, and the affection it needed. And though the puppy would always remember the woman who had given it life, it had learned that it was not alone. It had a new family now, one that would care for it, protect it, and love it for as long as it lived. As Dr. Jacobs watched the puppy play in the hospital yard one afternoon, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The little dog had found its way back from the depths of grief, and it had found new hope. In many ways, the puppy's journey mirrored the journey of the patients who passed through the hospital's doors every day. No one could avoid the hardships of life, no one could escape the pain of loss, but there was always the possibility of healing, of finding peace in the midst of sorrow. And in that moment, Dr. Jacobs realized something important. Love and loss were not defined by the limits of human understanding. They were universal, spanning across all living things, no matter their shape or size, and the bond between the puppy and its new family would be a reminder of that truth for as long as they all lived. The healing of the puppy was not instantaneous. It took time, days, weeks, and months of patient care and understanding before the little dog began to shed the weight of its grief. Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Allen had dedicated themselves to the task of helping the puppy move forward, but they soon realized that this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about feeding the dog, providing shelter, or offering comfort. This was about allowing the puppy to learn to trust again, to find new bonds, and to build a future beyond the pain of loss. In those early days, the puppy still returned to its post every evening, sitting by the hospital doors and staring longingly into the building, as though it was waiting for something or someone. But over time, the puppy began to accept the presence of those around it. Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Allen, and even the patients who had come to know the dog began to play a significant role in its healing process. Each interaction, each moment of kindness, helped the puppy understand that while it couldn't go back in time, it had the power to embrace the future. One evening, as Dr. Jacobs sat with the puppy on the hospital lawn, he marveled at how far the little dog had come. The puppy, who had once been so shy and withdrawn, now walked with confidence. Its tail wagged with excitement as it explored the garden, sniffing the flowers and running in circles, its energy back to its former self. Dr. Jacobs smiled to himself. He couldn't help but think that the puppy's healing mirrored the journeys of so many of the hospital's patients. They, too, came to the hospital broken in some way with bodies or hearts that had been torn apart by illness or injury. But just like the puppy, they had found a way to heal, to move forward, and to embrace life again. The more time Dr. Jacobs spent with the puppy, the more he realized how important this little dog had become to him. The puppy wasn't just another animal, its presence had come to symbolize something much greater. It represented hope, resilience, and the quiet strength that so many people, especially patients, needed to move past their darkest moments. The dog's recovery wasn't just about finding comfort from its loss. It was about finding the strength to embrace a future that was unknown, to trust that even after the deepest of pains, life could still offer something beautiful. As the puppy's healing continued, Dr. Jacobs began to see how the little dog was affecting the hospital staff as well. It was no longer just a pet or a distraction. It had become a source of strength for the entire community. Patients who had once felt isolated and alone found comfort in the puppy's companionship. It was not uncommon for patients in recovery to ask for the dog to visit their rooms, as the simple act of petting it brought a sense of peace. For many, the puppy was a reminder that healing wasn't just about the medical treatments, it was also about the connections we form with others, and the love that can exist even in the most difficult of circumstances. And one of the most powerful moments of healing came when a young woman named Sarah, who had been undergoing cancer treatment at the hospital for several months, requested to see the puppy. Sarah had been struggling with her own journey through illness, and she often felt a sense of loneliness that weighed heavily on her. She had heard about the puppy's story and the ways it had been helping others, and she wanted to meet the dog for herself. When Sarah first met the puppy, she was moved by its calm demeanor. Despite all the turmoil it had been through, the puppy greeted her with an unwavering trust, as though it understood that she too was struggling with something. Sarah sat down on the bench and let the puppy climb into her lap, feeling its warm body against her chest. For a few moments, she allowed herself to simply be in the presence of the dog, its gentle affection bringing her a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in months. "I've heard your story," Sarah whispered to the puppy, stroking its fur softly. "You've been through so much, haven't you? But look at you now. You're still here. You're still going, and so am I. Dr. Jacobs, who had been standing nearby, watched the interaction with a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that Sarah's words weren't just meant for the puppy. She was speaking to herself, reminding herself that even though the road ahead was uncertain, there was always hope. And sometimes that hope came from the most unexpected places, from a small puppy who had lost so much but who had found a way to continue moving forward. Sarah's recovery took time, just as the puppy's had, but in the months that followed, Sarah became a regular visitor to the hospital's garden, often sitting with the puppy and letting it bring her comfort. Over time, her condition improved, and she regained a sense of hope and optimism. The puppy had played an instrumental role in her healing, reminding her that life, despite its trials, still had moments of grace and beauty. For Dr. Jacobs, the puppy's story was a reminder that healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't a matter of simply fixing what was broken. It was about taking the time to nurture and support each individual on their own unique journey. Just as the puppy had needed love, patience, and care, so did the patients Dr. Jacobs worked with every day. His perspective on medicine had shifted. He realized that the most important part of healing wasn't always about the treatments or surgeries. It was about the emotional connections that help patients find the strength to keep going. The hospital itself had transformed as well. What had once been a place filled with the sterile coldness of medical procedures had become a home, a sanctuary where the bonds between staff and patients could flourish. The puppy had played a pivotal role in this transformation, reminding everyone that the heart of healing lay not just in medical science, but in the love and compassion we showed to one another. As the seasons changed and the puppy's healing continued, it became clear that the little dog had found its place within the hospital family. It wasn't just a pet anymore, it was a symbol of the hospital's mission, a reminder that even in the face of loss and hardship, there was always hope. The puppy's vigil outside the hospital doors, once filled with sorrow, had now become a celebration of life, of resilience, and of the deep connections that held people together. Dr. Jacobs often found himself thinking about the puppy's journey. When he first met the dog, he had seen it as just another stray, a small creature lost in a world that had been unkind to it. But now, as he watched the puppy play in the hospital garden, he saw something much greater. He saw the strength of the human spirit mirrored in the puppy's resilience. He saw how love, even in its smallest forms, had the power to heal, to bring light to the darkest of days. And as for the puppy, it had found a new family. The hospital staff, the patients, and even Dr. Allen had all become part of the puppy's story. Though it would always remember the woman who had cared for it, it had learned to open its heart to others. It had learned that while loss was an inevitable part of life, so too was the possibility of new beginnings. The puppy had come to symbolize something greater than itself. It had become a beacon of hope for everyone who had crossed its path. And in that, it had completed its journey not just from grief to healing, but from darkness into the light of a new day. As Dr. Jacobs watched the puppy run alongside the other patients in the hospital yard, he knew that this little dog had changed the course of his life forever. The lessons it had taught him about love, loss, and the strength to move forward would stay with him forever. And as for the puppy, it had found peace. It had found its place surrounded by love and surrounded by those who would never let it feel alone again.